It can be very difficult to watch any child struggle with learning, with connecting with peers, or with understanding information that is presented in the classroom. It's particularly painful for parents to watch their children struggle in these ways. This is why I'm so excited about the conversation I'm going to have today about what parents can do when they see their child struggling. Who do you reach out to? The teacher, the principal, and how do you do that? Do you send an email, pick up the phone, or write a formal letter? We are going to dive into that today.
Millions of kids struggle with learning, processing, and social emotional difficulties. These challenges interfere with their ability to reach their full potential. Dr. Karen Wilson is here to help. Her extensive background in pediatric neuropsychology and higher education have prepared her for this unique mission. Listen as she delivers content to inform, educate, and empower parents and educators. This will enable you to identify challenges that kids face and get them on the road to achieving their full potential. This is Diverse Thinking, Different Learning by ChildNEXUS.
Hello, everyone. Today, my guest is Leejanice Toback, an educational attorney and member of the ChildNEXUS professional community. Leejanice began her legal career as an assistant district attorney in Brooklyn, New York. She changed focus to civil trials involving negligence and product liability, and then transitioned over time to education law and special education in particular. I am so pleased to have Leejanice Toback to the podcast today. Welcome, Leejanice.
Thank you so much, Karen. Appreciate it. And I'm very glad to be here today.
I am thrilled to have you. First of all, how are you doing?
I'm very well, thank you. I've been obeying all of the rules about, secreting myself in my home office, wearing masks and everything else. So
I am doing the same. We are doing the same on this end as well. It's what's so interesting. I was reading your bio and I thought I would love you to tell listeners how you moved from being a trial attorney to special education law. And I didn't want to read it. I just felt that it'd be better to come directly from you because it's a really great story.
Sure. And I have to tell you that I haven't changed from being a trial attorney because special ed law is actually about being a trial attorney. And in the outside world, people think that a lot of times that, special ed law is just about dealing with kids. And this must be like a little practice that, people all get along and, it's just all nicey nice. And there really isn't a field of law here. And, it's just about holding hands. This is actually an extremely brutal kind of law. And parents in general think that the school is there to help their child and to be nice to their child. And this is one of the mistakes that they often make. And after I give you my bio, I'm going to tell you right now, because I have a client who's just retained me, and I want to give you an example of how this parent is sabotaging their child because they believe that the school district is their friend. But okay, let's talk about my bio. I started, as you said, as an assistant district attorney in Brooklyn. And one of the judges that sat on the appellate division, and for any of your listeners who happen to be attorneys, I will tell you that in New York, our court system works exactly opposite. In California, the Supreme Court is the lower court. It's called the Superior Court. In New York, the Supreme Court is our higher court. But anyway, I started that way as a trial attorney. So I had tried maybe 15 cases, before I was, in the 4 years that I was at being a DA. So I was pretty skilled as a trial attorney when I left because that's how it works. So I remember the first jury trial I ever did, and I sat there, and as they brought the jury in, I said, oh my God, if a bolt of lightning doesn't hit this courtroom in the next 15 seconds, I'm going to have to get up and say something. And that was one of the scariest moments of my life. But I did muddle through it. Anyway, after that, I did try criminal law for a bit, being a defense attorney. And I realized that I was never going to be really happy with the idea of defending criminals. So I did switch over to civil law and I did, civil trials. I did all kinds of civil trials, jury trials. And then I moved to California because I lived in the middle of Manhattan. I lived on the block with the United Nations. My son started to have problems. Nobody could tell me what they are. Nobody diagnosed him. I went to all of the doctors, the 100 best doctors in New York City. My son is 30 now, so it was a very different world then. Autism was not pushed. Nobody really knew what it was. But we moved to California when he was 7. And I started seeking services from, we will leave it as an unnamed district.
Mm-hmm.
They kept kind of putting me off. And I knew nothing about special ed. There were no courses in law school in special education when I went. So finally, I learned of an organization called TASK, Team of Advocates for Special Kids. And I went there and I spoke to them. And they said, well, if they give you a hard time, you call us. So I mentioned them. I said, well, if you don't give me a meeting, I will call them. Immediately, they gave me a meeting. And they call this an SST or some variety of that. And we had an SST, and parents have been through this, where they tell you all the possible things that are not going right. And you sit there for this 1-hour meeting. And then when you walk outside and you look at the piece of paper, you see that actually all they've done is given you assignments as to what you can do. They haven't really given any assignments as to what they can do. So it doesn't really, when you're sitting in the meeting, you think they're helping you, but the truth is that they're giving you jobs. So anyway, this went on for a while, and without recounting the entire story about my son, it took a couple of years, and it wasn't until I really became a special education attorney. And to do that, I partnered with a very well-known special ed attorney, and I said, well, I'll try your cases if you teach me special education. And it took me about 6 months of sort of apprenticing with her and reading Sattler, which is one of the guides to special education testing. Mm-hmm. And I learned Sattler backwards and forwards so that I really understand testing. And testing is the key. And then I really was trying the cases because I am a really good special ed attorney and a really good trial attorney. So now we're, 22 years later, and unfortunately, I don't get to try cases anymore because the districts that know me won't go to trial with me. They settle with me all the time. So when people look up my stats, I just don't show any trials anymore because I don't go to them. I have no objection to it, but things seem to settle. So that's my background.
Right.
So when I said to you about a case right now, what I wanted to explain to you and the people who are listening is that a client has called me and I asked her to forward her records, which is what I always ask clients to do. And when I looked at the records, I see that she has, instead of sitting in her IEP meeting quietly, she told the district all of the things that they should be doing. She told everything that was wrong with her child and everything that she was doing and everything that they should be doing. And she never spent any time sitting and listening to what the district was going to offer. And by doing so, she took the district off the hook because she never gave them an opportunity to say, this is what our offer is. This is what we feel we should offer. And this is very important. So sometimes I advise clients, depending on situations, don't take me to your IEP. Let the district do the wrong thing. Don't have them do the right thing, because sometimes you'll have a better case by just sitting and listening.
Mm-hmm.
So you wanted to talk about today how to get your child assessed, because that's probably the most important thing, is starting right.
Yes. And I think that right now, especially, I mean, pre-COVID, and that's the situation we're in right now, parents would see their kids struggle and wouldn't know what to do. They'd maybe communicate with the teachers what it is that they're seeing with respect to homework. Maybe they're seeing it in progress reports, or even in parent-teacher discussions, there's something that has been flagged for them. But right now, parents that are at home and they're watching their kids struggle, and they may not know, particularly with the younger ones, where this may be a struggle that they haven't seen before, how much of this is due to a neurodevelopmental or a learning disorder that's undiagnosed. How much of this is due to stress and having difficulty accessing remote learning, and they don't know where to begin. Like, where do they begin in terms of requesting services that they think their children need? So I'd love to start there for parents who are seeing their kids struggle, whether it's at school, face to face, if they have that opportunity, or at home with distance learning, and they want to find out if their kids qualify for services or if there's an issue that needs to be addressed.
Well, the first thing is, if their students are regional center clients, and that can mean regional center services can start at the beginning. It can start really at age 0 almost. And there are two kinds. They either stop at age 3 or they continue on. But the school district's responsibility begins at age 3. So if your child is age 3, that's when you can notify the school district to ask for assessment. At that point, you can get in touch with your school district and request an assessment for special education. So it's any time from 3 years up. And the way that you request the assessment is you have to describe what the struggle is, what you're seeing. And it can be academics. It can be physical problems, motoric. In other words, if the child can't write properly, but you have to keep it within the age group. In other words, up to 8, for example, if a child is writing backwards, that would be considered typical. However, if the child can't read, if you're saying at 8 years old, they're still not able to read, that's not typical. If they can't write letters, not typical. If they're having emotional breakdowns, if if they don't walk on time, if their language is stilted, if they're stuttering, if they're not absorbing language, In other words, if they're if they can't follow 3-step directions, if your 8-year-old, if you tell them go upstairs, get your shoes and come down and we're leaving, and they can't remember what you've said, so that by the time they get upstairs, they don't remember what you've said. So you're looking at all these fields: speech and language, occupational therapy, which is how they're writing. If their writing is scrunched up and at the end of the line they're running out of space, if their writing is huge, if it's crooked. You're looking at physical therapy. Are they like bumping into walls? Is the child able to speak? Can you understand them? Are you looking at signs of autism? Are they spinning around? Are they quiet? Will they not make eye contact? Any of these, but you have to specify in your letter as to what it is that you're seeing. Be specific and ask for an assessment in all of the areas that you feel the child has a problem. That's how you initiate. You write to the district in which you're residing. Now, if you're in LAUSD, then send the letter to the principal. If you're in any other district, you're probably better off sending it to the special education director in your district. If your child is in a private school, send it to the special ed director of the district that your school is attending. For example, if you're living in, let's say, LAUSD, but your child attends a private school in Santa Monica, you can send it to the special ed director in Santa Monica.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so detail the child has poor grades, spends 3 hours doing homework. If your child refuses to attend school, that's a problem. Don't take that upon yourself and say, well, it's my fault. Detail that the child has school refusal.
Mm-hmm.
Because if the child's eligible for special education, the district may give you a school refusal protocol and develop a plan for that. Attentional problems, are they all over the place? Is ADHD a problem? Have you gotten a diagnosis from a psychologist or a psychiatrist? Note any medication the student is on. If there's disinterest in other children, social problems, ask the school to assess in all of these areas. Make sure that you ask for all of these things, because they won't assess in the areas that you don't mention. So if it's speech and language, for example, make sure that you ask for articulation, which is how they speak. But word retrieval, can they come up with words, or are they having problems like that? Can they conduct meaningful conversations or not? Can they understand directions? Can they speak with other children? Now, when you send that letter, make sure that you keep a copy. So if you email it, you'll have a copy that it was received, or if you send it by letter or fax or whatever. Now, they will send you back an assessment plan saying that we will assess in these areas. You have 15 days to send that assessment plan back. Don't wait 15 days, because it keeps this going. Send it back immediately. After that, they have 60 days to perform the assessment, not counting the weeks off for spring vacation, for holiday break and for the summer. So they get a very, very long time to do this. When they get the assessment plan, when you return it, tell them that you want the reports at least 5 days in advance. Now, if somebody hires me to look these over and maybe to come with them, I decide at that point in time,
Mhm.
I like to look at those reports several days in advance, because when I look at those reports, I have a sense of whether they're going to qualify the student or not, because I know what tests they've used and I can look at their scoring. And so then I know. And it's important for me to look at those findings. Now, whether the student is going to be qualified or not very often depends on what tests they've used, because testing is really an art and not a science. There are a lot of tests that score low. There are a lot of tests that score high. And how you use them will depend on whether a child qualifies. But they will have an IEP team meeting. If your child, no matter where your child is, whether in private school or in public school, they have to make an offer of placement if your child is found qualified. If the child's in a private school, you cannot have an IEP. Private school children don't get an IEP, but you have the option then of placing your child in a public school and taking their offer. If you disagree with the IEP, you may disagree in whole or in part. You can take part of their IEP, you can refuse part of it. The other thing is, if you don't agree with the testing, you may ask for an independent educational evaluation.
And I want to talk about that. And that is so important. But I want to back up a minute, because this process that you're outlining is so important.
Mhm.
And I think it's important because a lot of parents don't know what to ask for. And I think you've outlined beautifully how specific they need to be regarding what it is that they're seeing and what areas they want assessed. And one question I have for you, and parents have asked this question: can the school district refuse to do the assessment if they don't agree that it's necessary?
That gets them into litigation when they say that they're refusing to do an assessment. I have had that situation before where they say they don't see that there's a need
Yes.
for it. It's a it's a very iffy position for a school to take when they don't want to do it, because the law is that a parent, is entitled to have a student assessed. But when the school says, well, the student is getting all A's and we don't see anything,
Mm-hmm.
and we're going to stick to that, this is the mountain that they want to die on, then the parent has a few choices as to how they want to go.
Okay.
They can either wait and reiterate their request at a later time, because sometimes when you have a kindergartner, it's very difficult to show that the child needs special education. The way that the tests are done, academically, it's very difficult to show, because you're always looking for a discrepancy in academic ability. And you don't have to do enough things on the test to show that the kindergartner is behind. There's not enough academic answers that they can produce that are going to show that the kindergartner is academically trailing his or her peers.
Mm-hmm.
As far as ADHD, the same thing. So when you have a kindergartner who's very mild,
Mm-hmm.
it's difficult to get them special education services unless they are more severe. Now, so some parents will wait until first grade when it starts to show up more in a way that the school district can show it. Other parents will pursue private services and then bring them to the school with a private assessment. And then the law is that the district only has to consider it, but does not have to accept it. As I say, it again depends on what diagnosis we're seeing with a kindergartner, because that's where you really see this problem when they refuse to assess.
Yes.
As students get older, you don't really have that problem.
Right. And I think that that's where it's that age, that kindergarten, first grade, where parents seem to get pushback. And those are the parents that I've spoken to, where I've had a parent tell me, and again, I won't say the school district, they requested a speech and language assessment, and the school district said, he's going to be fine. We don't think it's significant enough, and asked the parent to retract the request for the speech and language assessment.
The parent should never retract the request. Absolutely not.
Mm-hmm.
And in that case, because a speech and language assessment is way less costly than a psycho-ed assessment, it would be in the parent's best interest to pursue a private speech and language assessment and go forward. But, with me, it's mainly the kindergartners.
Right.
First grade, usually I don't have that problem, although I did have a student. I started representing her in first grade. I represented her through the 11th grade. And in first grade, they refused to qualify her. Her eventual qualification was emotionally disturbed. And in first grade, they insisted that she was just like any other typical kid.
Mm-hmm.
And they refused to qualify her. And I could not get her qualified until actually the third grade, although I got her, 504 accommodations, but I could not get her qualified as emotionally disturbed until third grade.
And I think that's one of the problems with the system, is that it's almost like kids have to fail before they can get services, or fall significantly behind before they can get services. I had a mom tell me that her child, and she saw, again, the struggle in kindergarten with following directions, with keeping up with the peers. And she was told by the teachers and the principal that her child was fine and that it wasn't significant enough to be a concern or warrant an assessment. She got a private assessment and found out that her child had autism, high functioning autism, but the school district was saying that the child was fine. So now the child is eligible for services, but had she not done that, she would not have had a diagnosis to begin with, and then her child would not have received services. And we know that early intervention is so important for so many kids who are struggling with either autism spectrum disorder, ADHD, dyslexia. You have better outcomes when you intervene early. And this idea of waiting for them to really fall behind and be significantly impaired is problematic for a number of reasons.
And that's absolutely true. I mean, the school district, for the most part, will attempt to put everything off so that either they can deny services or they can delay services. I mean, there's a reason why the students in our system, by the ninth grade are reading at the third grade level.
Mm-hmm.
It's not because they're giving out services, it's because they're not. And so, my whole point is getting them qualified as early as I can. And, for the most part, we get them qualified in kindergarten, but it so happens that there are certain kids that we can't do it because they fall on, right at that line where the school district assesses them or refuses to assess them. And even if you get a private assessment, because I've done it, they're right at the line where you end up with a 504 plan for them because they just don't meet the qualifications of special ed because they can sit in a classroom and it's not observable enough. They have ADHD. They have ADHD, but their class is only a couple of hours a day, and so they're not that attention seeking or unable to pay attention. Although now, pre-COVID, they're moving the curriculum so quickly to reading that we are seeing more impacted kids in kindergarten. Because a friend of mine who's a teacher, and she teaches K, she says that she has about 5 children a year now who absolutely cannot stay in the class. They just can't do the work because, the school districts have now taken Piagetian norms and thrown them in the sewer. They're now taking kindergartners and expecting them to read and write. And so for those kindergartners that have ADHD problems or they're aught, or you can't make them SLD because there's just not enough. You're not going to get enough spread for it. So you can't do that. But you can make them ADHD or aught.
Mm-hmm. And when you say SLD, just for people who may not understand, it's a specific learning disorder. And then obviously ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and autism spectrum disorder.
Yeah. To get a specific learning disorder, you need a large discrepancy between their cognitive ability and their work. Mm-hmm. And given that in kindergarten, they do so little work, they're not capable of getting the discrepancy between it because on a test, they only have to write one letter, or, on an academic model, or they have to write one number. So they always score in the average range. You can't get anything out of the average range for a kindergartner. So you can't prove that they actually have a learning disability.
Right. And so you're kind of describing the situation where, when kids are younger, it's harder to get them identified because they're still, for many of them, they're still developing skills. And again, you can't get this discrepancy because there are things that you can't assess yet because they're still learning. But there are also those kids who fall through the cracks because the gap is not wide enough for them to qualify for services. And I think about these really bright kids,
right,
struggle in an area or two, but they can compensate either with an exceptional memory or some other cognitive area.
Right.
But at a cost, because again, if you have a 30-minute homework assignment and it's taking you 3 hours, that's incredibly frustrating for a child or any individual to have to deal with that.
Well, I try to get them qualified under speech and language when they're in kindergarten. or as I said, under ADHD, or some other category of other health impaired. A lot of them have speech and language problems, those kinds of kids that we're talking about.
Right.
Yeah, or attentional issues.
And that's great that you are getting them the services early on, because we know from the literature that the longer students go without the support, the larger the gap
Absolutely
comes between them and their peers. And then you get this increase in frustration. And then you get, for some kids, emotional distress as a result. So you get the anxiety and the depression in third grade for kids who've been struggling since kindergarten.
Absolutely. And there's also the social issues, but the kids that are struggling in kindergarten, a lot of times with them, it is also a social problem that they have. I mean, it's the whole gamut of problems that they have that you see in kindergarten. Wouldn't you agree that when you see kindergartners who are potential special ed kids, that you are seeing a full gamut of problems when they start that early?
Yes. And it depends obviously what you're seeing, but you do see whatever the difficulty is impacting a lot of areas beyond academic. So if you mentioned ADHD. So if kids are struggling with attention, not only is that going to impact them in the classroom in terms of their ability to sit and listen during circle time and pay attention to calendar, but they can't pay attention to maybe social cues on the playground, or they're impulsive and other kids are pushing back, which affects their social functioning, or they're impulsive. And so you do see it impacting more than just academics. So I completely agree with you. You see it academics and socially.
When kids are struggling in kindergarten, these are kids that have global problems generally, because the kids that just have academic problems, and most of them have more than just academic problems, but the kids that have academic problems don't show up until later than that. The kindergarteners or the kids that show up at age 3 are, they have more global problems. So, as I said, with, trying to get the kindergarteners assessed, they do occasionally push back. And then who the child is depends on how much the parent needs to push back. But there are ways, and we do push back, and it just depends on really the child. And that's true with everything in special ed. It's so geared to the unique needs of every child, because they are so unique. It's amazing, that every due process I file, I have to write from scratch. You would think that there would be a paper that I had and I could just fill in the names or the blanks, but it doesn't work that way. They are all unique. They may have some similar traits, but by and large, they're unique, and they all have their little quirks about them, And so there are lots of schools, that I place students in, but I always tell parents that as much as a school is going to be way better for them, nothing will ever be perfect, because your child is so unique.
Absolutely. Absolutely. There's not a one size fits all for every child who has a specific diagnosis or a specific area of difficulty. And I do want to say that I've worked with a lot of schools who've been very, very supportive of families whose kids are struggling. And so it's not that parents can expect pushback all the time. We've kind of talked about some instances where parents have been encouraged to not pursue an assessment or been refused an assessment. But there are a number of schools that I've worked with who really want the best for that child. And when they do the assessment, their intention is to support that child and help that child be successful in their environment. And when that happens, it's a beautiful thing, and everybody is happy, and you get to see the best from that child. But I want to go back to something else that you said. You mentioned that once you go through the IEP process, which is individualized education plan, and the school district does an assessment, if the assessment shows that if the child is not showing significant difficulties to warrant services. You mentioned an IEE. Do you want to talk about what that is and when parents should ask for it?
It's an independent educational evaluation, and it's something that you have to ask the school for. And typically, if they agree to grant one, they will give you a list of names of professionals that you can use. But the truth is, you don't have to use their professional. You are entitled to use anyone that you want to, provided that professional meets the standards that are set forth by the district. They have a list of standards, and most of the psychologists meet those standards. For example, I think you do them, don't you?
I do. I've done a number of IEEs for families.
And there are a number of other psychologists in LA that do them. It's somebody who is an evaluator who's used to administering tests, and they give tests that the school district doesn't do because they're used to the ones the school district does. And so they provide a different set of tests, and they give a different type of opinion, although they may end up agreeing with the school district and say that they did a fair assessment. But it's something that you can do, and this way you can either confirm what the school district said, or on the other hand, you can find that you don't agree with what the school district said. And since it is an independent educational evaluation, another IEP is held, and your assessor, the independent assessor, comes to the meeting, and both assessors talk about the assessment, and the district is mandated to listen to and consider your assessor as well, and give it the same amount of consideration as they do their own assessor. And, I've sat in many meetings where that has happened, and sometimes they find that the independent evaluator has very good information to share, and sometimes they change their mind about things. And sometimes they don't. And we've filed for due process and then made an agreement about what we're going to do. So this is a very effective technique in persuading the district about what services might be best for the child. I don't know, what has your experience been with that?
I think that anytime I've done an IEE, the school district has incorporated the recommendations that I've made into the education plan moving forward. And I think one of the things that happens when you do an independent evaluation that's not consistent with a school evaluation is that if you get a private psychologist or neuropsychologist to do that evaluation, you will get a diagnosis if it's there. And the school assessment isn't going to make a diagnosis. They're going to determine whether or not you qualify for services. Oftentimes the diagnosis will either get you an IEP or at least a 504 plan.
Well, my experience, as I said, has been that they have considered the IEE, and they have either agreed to an IEP or We have filed for due process, and we have gone to mediation, and we have gotten an IEP and compensatory services.
Right.
So I haven't had a problem with that either. It has been a very effective tool. I did want to say along the lines of what you discussed that there are certain districts that are extremely cooperative. And I wanted to agree with you that I have worked with districts and I have worked with attorneys who represent certain districts who are extremely cooperative. And it is wonderful when you do work with districts like that, that instead of butting heads, they're on board with working for what the child needs instead of spending their time arguing about what they're not going to do.
Right. And I think I know if we come back to full circle, the reason why we're doing this is because we're seeing kids struggle.
Yes.
And, that's the whole reason I'm doing this podcast is because so many people see kids struggle and they often don't know what to do. They don't know, is this severe enough to need services? And if it is, how do I find out if that's the case? And so that's why it was so important for me to have you on, because so many parents don't know what their options are when they're seeing difficulty. Mm-hmm. And I think it's tremendously helpful for them to know that they can ask for an assessment if they're concerned, and that if they're encouraged to not pursue an assessment, that they can push a little harder for that they have options in terms of looking at getting a private evaluation, or even if their kids are really young, a speech and language assessment, maybe even through a referral from their physician. And so there are things that they do to document the difficulties their child is having. And then it sounds like to really document and keep notes in terms of what their observations are, particularly if kids are very young and they can't really do a full psychoeducational assessment in kindergarten by the school district, that they at least keep notes and pay attention to the struggles. And when it comes to first grade, request that assessment again through the school district or request a private assessment.
Any parent who feels that there's a problem should request an assessment. There is no problem asking for it. There's no cost, and they can ask for it. There's no time limit. In other words, they can ask for it in kindergarten, they can ask for it in first grade, or they could ask for it in the beginning of kindergarten and ask for it again at the end of kindergarten. There's no reason not to ask for it if you feel your child is struggling. You can get a baseline for an assessment. There's no reason not to do this, because if you have a feeling, parents actually are very good judges of what's going on. They have a feeling about things. And that's why I talked about how many years ago I had a feeling that something was wrong. And everyone told me, that he was just fine. So it took until 10 years old that I realized that my son had autism. And the school kept shining me on. They kept giving him more and more services. And it wasn't until 10 years old, when I really became a special ed attorney full time, that it suddenly hit me that he had autism. And when I went to the school and went to his resource teachers and said, you know what, he has autism. And they rolled their eyes at me like, what does she want now? We've given her every service. They rolled their eyes at me like, what does she want now? And this is what happens. I'm not saying that some schools aren't supportive. The district that I was in ended up having to give him every service in the world. But that was because I was an attorney. And it was because I had waited so long and because I had struggled so hard and because they finally just wanted to get rid of me. And so they paid for a private school that I had started with a teacher that he could go to, that they ended up paying for because they just wanted me out of there, which I completely understand. And I don't blame them at that point, you know. But just to give you one more anecdote from that time, when he was in second grade, they decided that they would give him mental health therapy because they didn't know what was wrong. So at that time, my son was wearing hearing aids, and they gave him a mental health therapist from county mental health. And the principal passed by and said, "What is that old guy doing playing Monopoly with Elroy?" My son's name is Landon Royce, which is Elroy. "What is that old guy doing playing Monopoly with Elroy?" So that was the explanation of the services.
Mm-hmm.
So the mental health provider, who wore hearing aids too and was from New York like we were, he came to me after about 5 months and said, "I don't know why I'm giving him mental health services because he doesn't have any problems." Okay. That was how they were giving him services. They
Mm-hmm.
couldn't even figure out why. That explains the school-based services.
Right. And I'm glad that, your son had you as a mom to push
I don't know about
and
that, but
but you figured it out and you had the experience and
he needed OT and PT, and they had somebody playing Monopoly with him.
right.
So I got a private OT and PT. I got a private OT who said he needs PT. And so they ended up giving him OT and PT and canceling the mental health services when the mental health guy said that he's perfectly well adjusted.
And I think that's a good example of a mom's intuition. You know what your son needs.
That's why I brought it up.
Right.
That's the funniest thing in a school giving services. And from that day on, I would tell my clients that schlock services are worse than no services.
Mm-hmm.
Because when a school loads up a kid with services that have no purpose, it's worse than having none because everybody thinks the child is being serviced, but they're not making any progress.
Right. And that's why the services have to be appropriate to the needs of the student, and you have to track progress. So those are, really important factors. This is such great information that you are sharing, Leejanice, and I really think that your experience and the knowledge that you have is going to help someone else who is seeing their child struggle and is trying to figure out what to do next. So I'm just so grateful to have you on the podcast and have this discussion with you. It's been really informative, and I think, and I know it's going to help someone else.
I really hope so. That's my purpose in doing this. It was my experience is all that I can really convey to somebody. My knowledge and my experience is helpful to someone else who is now walking in my shoes, because I had a child who's dyslexic, dysgraphic, autistic. So, whatever I can convey, however I can help someone else, I'm happy to do it. And that's why I do what I do, instead of where I was, instead of personal injury, which is a lot more lucrative. But I do what I do to help other people and to pass it on.
And I'm so grateful for you for doing that. Now, I know that people are probably going to want to get in touch with you and may have questions for you or seek you out for a consultation. What is the best way for people to get in touch with you?
Well, they can either email me. My email is very simple. It's kidslaw@msn.com, which is, Microsoft Network, MSN. And Kids Law is very easy. Or they can call me. I'm going to give you my cell phone because I don't mind being called on my cell, and I'm available that way more easily. It's 949-290-1595. And I have a website, Law Offices of Leejanice Toback. I guess it's .com. It must be.
We'll put it in the show notes so they'll know.
If they look me up, they'll find me. So I'm pretty available.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
It's been great spending time with you, Karen. I really enjoyed it.
I enjoyed it too.
I know you do the same thing because your heart's in it, in doing this and helping kids.
Absolutely. It's the reason why we do what we do. So thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Really been great.
I am incredibly grateful to Leejanice for not only providing great information for parents who are seeing their kids struggle in school, but also for sharing her personal story of navigating the educational system and trying to get appropriate services for her own son. She reiterates the importance of an evaluation and getting students the support that they need, but she also reviewed the challenges of qualifying for services, particularly when kids are struggling and they're very young. I would love to hear from you. Tell me what you thought about this episode and join our community on ChildNEXUS.com. You will get updates on upcoming episodes, webinars, workshops, and articles written that address the issues that many students face. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you next week.
Thanks for listening to Diverse Thinking, Different Learning by ChildNEXUS. For more resources, visit us online at childnexus.com.